podcasting is the avenue in which we're expressing the thing. It doesn't necessarily need to be about the podcast. The best podcasts are really going to be devotional practice about the thing. And you're using this alchemy of conversation, especially interview shows with other people, to inspire the thing that you're so passionate about.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
What's up, podcaster? It is Adam A. Adams, and today we've got an interview episode. And actually, Ryan Estes, who's our guest, he actually has two companies that serve podcasters. And he had a podcast, which ends up not doing it now because he's so embedded in serving podcasters. We're going to be focused on inner critic today, offering words of encouragement to you. So it's interesting. There's a lot that kind of holds us back, even to start a podcast or to keep going with a podcast. And I want Ryan to kind of go through a little bit of that since he worked with so many podcasters. And then we will definitely shout out a couple of his businesses. Now, a business partner of his, Brandy, has been on the podcast from Kitcaster. And that's one of the top companies that I recommend if you're trying to get booked on other people's shows. Kitcaster can really help. And it's kind of cool. I'm in the Denver area and so are they. So they're all local and they do a really, really good job. And they've got another company that also helps you to be able to make money. So if you're looking to have sponsors on your podcast where you can make a little bit of dough from that, he's got another company that we will talk about as well. Ryan, welcome to the show. And let's talk about what's holding people back. What is this inner critic? What does it do to us? How does it make us feel? What have you seen? Take it away, brother.
You bet, man. Adam, it's so exciting to be on the show. I really appreciate it. I'm so happy to be here. Brandy said so many good things about you. Fan of your work. I love that you support podcasters. It's awesome. I'm just happy to be here. So yeah, let's talk about the inner critic. And I'll just kind of use this as an entry point to how I got into podcasting. I was in the music business for a long time, 10, 15 years, and had a couple of kids. And being that the music business, particularly on a local level, is not necessarily the fulcrum of commerce, I decided that I was getting out of the music business. So I got a square job and sat at a desk and started dreaming about making my own business, which was great. It ended up really good for me. Music was awesome, but I needed the change. The problem that I didn't foresee is that it was very difficult to, one, kind of like escape my identity as a musician. And even more so was to kind of like be away from the camaraderie of having a band. I was used to having these 5 or 6 guys that were just my ride or die brothers that I'd see them a couple of times a week. And the really fun aspect of having a band is just talking trash over beers with your buddies. All this was brand new to me. So I broke off with the band. I quit my gig working as a music promoter and basically was alone with my family, which was wonderful. Those little babies were amazing. But at this time, the job I took was in Superior. So you'll know, at the time I was living in Lone Tree. So I'm driving from Lone Tree to Superior, which is just south of Boulder a little bit. It was like 90-minute commute. I burned out my playlist really quickly. And honestly, I couldn't really listen to much music because I was still kind of so like damaged by the music industry that I needed something else. This is probably 2007, 2008, right around the time of iPhone 2. So I heard about podcasts. This is when you still had to like hook it up to your computer and download the show into your phone. And I started falling in love with podcasts. This was like when Rogan was still interviewing people in his like bedroom. I mean, this goes way back and I loved it. Not only did just seem to like keep me entertained in the traffic, but also oh, that's funny. I was scratching my shirt and it gave a thumbs up.
Wait, so you started listening to podcasts basically when podcasts first came out? Like first, when it was even being a thing, you're already part of the listening side.
Pretty early, I started listening. I was turned on to podcasting largely because you could search categorically. So it was very similar to like that eye-opening up moment when you got an iPhone and you're like, wow, there's an app for everything. It was like, oh, there's a podcast for everything. So I started really diving into these different areas that I was interested in, whether that be comedy or sports, or there's a great series called Field of Weeds from a Korean Zen monk that I loved, Henry Grevenberg. Shout out. I know he's out there somewhere. So I just started like really exploring podcast landscape. became obsessed with it. And honestly, it kind of took me out of like a blue spot. I was feeling down. I had a lot of pressure and had this big life change, and it made me feel better. So anyway, I'm like, you know what? My buddy's got a music studio. I could record a podcast. And so I called the boys in the band and we're like, hey, you guys want to get together? They're like, yeah. You want to get the band back together? I'm like, oh, no. No music. Yeah, I want to do everything from band practice, just without instruments. So just like, we're just going to get beers. We're going to hang out. It's going to be fun. So I started a podcast called 8th Grade Ball at that time.
Wait a second. So how many podcasts have you had, and or the name of them? Because I already knew Denver Business Podcast, which you later rebranded. Is this that same podcast that was rebranded again, or is this a different podcast?
This was my first podcast, which I never rebranded. I just let it go.
Okay. What year was that? Like,
that was probably 2008.
All right. So if you're listening, Ryan has started a podcast in 2008, right before the crash. And I started my first podcast 9 years later. 9 years
Nice.
later. So you got some history, you got some experience. So I'm looking forward to letting the listener know from all of your experience. So 2008, you decide to get with your buddies, have some beers, do all the stuff that you would do in the band, but with no instruments. Take it from there. Where were we?
You bet. Right there. So we're doing it in a recording studio with like German microphones and $200 headphones. I mean, it was a very well-produced podcast and just having a ball, telling stories, ragging on each other. Again, like Rogan is ubiquitous with podcasting and he's got a 500 gazillion downloads. But back then he was a real originator. And so there was, at the time, Brian Redband was like the producer of the show. And he created this thing called DEATHSQUAD Podcast Network. And so there were kind of like different pods of podcasts around the country that were doing similar inspired shows, but also all together on Twitter. And all the people in podcasting at the time kind of doing irreverent, kind of guerrilla radio type stuff were all kind of a tight-knit community. So doing the show, promoting it on Twitter was big at the time. Twitter was brand new. The show grew in popularity pretty well and pretty quickly. So I did that show for a long time, which started out with my band buddies, and then it became kind of an interview podcast. I started interviewing a lot of people in MMA. I train jiu-jitsu here in Denver and have forever. So I'd bring in local fighters and comedians and musicians. And really, it did just become an extension of my experience in the entertainment industry, which is just having interesting people and like hanging out parlor style. So I had that show for a long time. And then as my media and marketing agency kind of took root, I saw the utility of these conversations. I saw that like, not only was I having these really interesting conversations with people, but I was realizing that some of the problems that they were having, I could solve through my business. And so a lot of the guests I had on the show became clients. At that point, kind of a light bulb went off and it's like, you know what, maybe we should start taking this podcast thing a little more seriously. This is probably 10 years ago. So 2013, something like that. At which point I was like, okay, as much as I loved 8th Grade Ball, it was so crazy. I was like, maybe let's put on our trousers and have a grown-up podcast. So at that point, the marketing agency I had was called Lumen Station, and we started the Denver Business Podcast. One, as a way to feature kind of local business people and founders, but also as kind of like a Trojan horse. So I could get to know them, get to know their companies, see what their pain points were. And if I could be of service with my company, great. If not, maybe I could give them a recommendation to a vendor or a colleague, which was also awesome, and meet some cool people around at the same time.
What year was that?
That was probably 2013.
Okay, 2013. And I still didn't even know what a podcast was yet. It was, I think it was 2014 or 2015 that I got my first iPhone.
Yeah.
And I was like, what does this purple thing do? And I clicked on it and started listening. And that's when I fell in love. That's when I was like, this is sick. But you had started your second podcast already before I even listened to one. All right, keep going.
Yeah. So that show progressed. It was a great local feature. It did really good. Popular in the Denver area, did exactly what I wanted to. I made a lot of great relationships I had with business owners in the local area, which was my number one concern, and just had some fun with it. From there, I was like, you know what?
Hey, Ryan, can I interrupt you?
Oh, please.
So you mentioned that in 2008, your podcast was gaining a lot of traction. It was doing really well in its space.
Yeah.
How did this one do that you started the Denver Business Podcast in 2013? How was that doing? Did it have a lot of listeners, a little bit of listeners? Is it a bad thing that is just there for one like city? There's all of these people in all of these countries in the world. and you only were really focused on Denver. And so did that hold you back? Did it make it bigger? Did you start it earlier? I'm real curious about kind of like the traction that it was getting.
You bet. Eighth Grade Ball, I think at its peak had probably 10,000 downloads per episode. And I would do probably one or two a week, which was pretty darn good back then. Denver Business Podcast was much less. It ended up probably peaking around 1,500 per episode as far as downloads go. And it was kind of put in a local container for a reason, largely because if you want to be Dave Ramsey and you want to do business advice to everybody, that's fantastic. But really, I wanted to get a snapshot of Denver founders, particularly so they could see what my business interests were, which were local. The other point of the show was to get people in my office. We had this beautiful office over on 32nd and Larimer, and I did all my shows or all my recordings in-house. So they'd come and we'd be in this big, beautiful table and we'd serve food and we'd have cocktails and do intros with music. It was just kind of a big impression. Again, because I was trying to make a good impression on these folks to see if we could work together. And a lot of times that worked out really well. But to your point, our service offering started to diverge from a local offering. And we started looking towards national brands, bigger brands, international brands. And so I realized the scope of the podcast could kind of adjust itself to a national audience. So at that point, rebranded the show from Denver Business Podcast became Talk Launch. This was probably in 2016, 2017, that we rebranded the show and went national. At that time, too, you know what? Actually, let me try and think. This is probably a little bit earlier than that. Anyway, we'll go with the timeline because it works. But at this time as well, Zoom came out. And Zoom was just like Skype, only like had all these better features and it was free. And I was like, wow, actually the audio coming off Zoom, not fantastic, but with a little touch up, we can really make things happen. This was right in the beginning. And so I was like, Zoom is so easy to get people to record. At that time, there was also Zencastr. We were using Zencastr. We were using a bunch of different tools to record remotely. But I was like, we can get people on board. And if they have like the iPhone earpods, not the AirPods, but like the actual earbuds, those actually have a really good microphone and you could get solid recordings remotely. And so we started putting together kind of interviewing people remotely, which is how 99% of these interview shows go now. So that point really started Talk Launch as my central podcast.
So a couple questions on the rebrand. And I think the listener will get value out of this as well. A, do you feel, I've got a lot of questions, so I'm going to just write them down. Like, did you disappoint your listener when you switched from Denver Business Podcast to Talk Launch? Did you let down your listener?
I don't think so. I never got any negative feedback and the numbers remained the same. There wasn't a significant loss. There wasn't a significant gain. It was just kind of like, it remained kind of the same.
And what did you have to do to rebrand? Like, what was kind of the process? What were the things you focused on, whether it was artwork or music or intros or whatever? How did that go? And was there any tricks in the rebrand with doing that you thought helped you, or that is there anything you would have done different? I know it's like a 3-part question, never supposed to do that, but going to your relaunch, what did you specifically do on purpose? What worked well, and what would you do differently?
You bet. So to change, it was the artwork. It was the theme song. The format of the show remained exactly the same. The website changed. So kind of a facelift. One thing I've definitely learned over time is how to get better at the actual launch part. And I find that a lot of times this is what podcasters struggle with, particularly around a launch or a rebrand or a relaunch, is you get to the 5-yard line, but you don't push it into the touchdown. Because
give us more on that. What is missing there?
Communication, to actually have a launch, let people know what's happening. There's a tendency I have, and maybe people can relate to that. It's like you get everything ready and it's really fun to have your head down and working on something. But when it's time to like unveil your baby and bring your baby to the world and say, hey, look at this, there's some apprehension there because you feel like you're going to be judged. You don't want to make a spectacle of yourself, whatever. And that's something that I didn't do, is I didn't take the time to say like, hey, everybody, look at me. Look at what's happening right now.
Does that go back to the inner critic stuff then? Is this like us not actually marketing our show? Is that mistake happen because we think that there's something wrong with us? We're not sure if we're good enough or what?
Yeah, I think all that. It certainly does. For me, I think there's just kind of a vulgarity, I feel like, of like self-promotion. Not that I judge other people, but I just have always kind of not imagined myself as being the guy that, hey, look at me. there's a different persona when you're performing on stage. And if I'm behind a microphone and a guitar, you're creating mystique, you're creating a character. Like when you show up and this like, hey, my name's Ryan Estes and this is what I'm all about. Boy, it's intimidating. And also like there's a certain Dunning-Kruger effect that the more you learn, the more you know you have to learn. And it just, you start to feel a little bit anxious about it. A lot of that double talk is in your head. And a lot of times this is what keeps people from actually doing the launch. Rather, they're just going to kind of tiptoe in and start doing what they're doing. But we live in a world of algorithms. So really you need a lot of heat. And a launch, a relaunch, a rebrand is the perfect opportunity to get a lot of heat and a lot of like clicks going on what you're doing, which hits the algorithm, which hits the recommendation, which builds a lot of momentum for your show, which we've seen done successfully dozens and dozens of times with people getting to those top 10 podcasts or that top 1% show based on all this like energy you can get from kind of that look at me energy. So one thing that's really difficult, though, is getting over that inner critic of like whatever it is. Maybe it's fear you're not good enough, fear you're too good, fear the artwork sucks, fear you don't have the right music, fear whatever that may be, of like letting that go, allowing yourself to be a little clumsy, allow yourself to make mistakes and just push forward and be excited about the thing you've got. Because ultimately you're just, it's all these machines that are kind of dictating the success of our show and whether you get recommended or you're not. The anxiousness around the show will never go away, but it's a lot more fun to do that with the large audience listening to you than nobody.
And are you saying that if we don't have a good launch strategy where we're telling other people about our show, that we won't get recommended? Is that kind of what you're saying? And if so, could you go into a little bit more detail on the algorithms?
Yeah, you bet. That's exactly right. Things are changing and things are changing all the time. Way back in the day when I was doing 8th grade ball, and I remember Spreaker came out. And so I switched over to Spreaker because you could do live interviews and record live. It was cool. But they had a little recommendation on their homepage that had a little scroller of podcasts. And I just emailed them and was like, hey, would you guys feature my podcast? And they're like, sure, which was amazing. And I definitely recommend people try that. We do get kind of bogged down in like a lot of tips and hacks of like trying to beat the system when a lot of times there's people, there's web developers behind those pages.
So actually, this seems like something valuable to not just the listener, but maybe even to me and my clients. We work with a bunch of podcasters.
Yeah.
How would I teach a client, or how would you teach the listener how to do that in real life? Like going and finding somebody to promote their podcast just the way that you did. Who would we reach out to? How would we reach out to them? What would we say?
Those are all the right questions to ask. The big one is, what do I want? I want more listeners. Be like, okay, where are my listeners hanging out? Well, they're definitely on podcast apps. Like, okay, it's going to be hard to get through to somebody on Spotify or Apple, but how many podcast players are there on iOS? A couple dozen. Hit up the smaller people. Be like, hey, I love your podcast player. How do I get recommended by your app? And
okay,
buy them lunch. Give them a free t-shirt. People will throw their grandmother down the stairs for a free t-shirt. No, probably not. But, but just ask. So like having clarity, I think, is the most important thing. What do I want? I want to grow my show. I want more numbers. If that's what you want, devise a schedule of how you can execute that. And just like being out front and asking people that are in the position to give you what you want, that's a great place to start. There are ways, of course. You have the major players being, I think Spotify's got the #1 spot now, but of course, Apple is significantly important. And both of those companies rely on similar metrics, which is like the amount of subscribers, the amount of listens, the amount of downloads, all of these kind of metrics that podcasters are very familiar with. Those are important to get in certain time periods. So as far as just like a technical aspect, it's like, look through your phone. Are there 10 people that can rate and review whatever you're doing right now? They'll do it. Okay, great. Can you get a magnitude of 10 on that? Can you get 100 people to rate and review your show personally right now? Maybe not. That's a lot. 100 people is a lot.
I've known a couple of people that have done that, gotten 100 or 200. And it was a matter of phone calls and text messages.
Yeah.
And where I wanted to go is thinking about the inner critic. Could you give us a little bit more, anything that you've done? Because the truth is, I have inner critic. I have imposter syndrome. I have all of these things that anyone has. So I have to assume, Ryan, that you're normal and that you felt it as well. But you still started 8th Grade Ball. You still started Denver Business Podcast. You still rebranded to Talk Launch. You still are being successful every day. So when we feel the inner critic, when we feel this stuff, what is the way for us to get over it?
Yeah, that's tough. For me, there's no getting over it.
That's interesting.
It's always going to be there. But I put a practice around it to allow myself the opportunity to be brave. For me, it's perfectionism. It's hard for me to let something go into the world because I see all the errors and I will just stay. Plus, I really like working on little problems and I like to put my head in the sand. So perfectionism for me was really tough. And podcasting is particularly hard because there's so many things to obsess about. There's the subject matter, the content, there's the tone of my voice, there's the actual texture of the sound through the hardware that I'm using. There's the million different ways you can edit the sound. There's the music beds you can put underneath. There's so much. There's the liner notes. There's the pictures. I used to do all these like cool pinup posters for each episode. I mean, there's a million different ways. And I would get totally hung up and I would have like 7 episodes in the can. And I'm just like, yeah, it's not ready. And then it was brutal. And it was making me want to quit because I was like, this is too much. It's overwhelming.
I swear that the listener feels that now, or definitely has felt that way. It gets overwhelming. There's a lot in front of you, or there's a lot behind you. You get hung up on a detail or two, perfectionism. You see errors. And actually, my mother's launching a podcast right now.
Nice.
And we're working with her. She hired our company. So I've been spending a lot more time talking to my mom. Now, we've always had a great relationship, but we might talk once every couple months. And lately, we've been talking twice a week. And I think that the perfectionism is something that she has felt because she had been in the corporate world for a long, long time. And as she's doing this entrepreneurship thing, she wants it to be great. Her presentations at work were fantastic, and she wants this to be fantastic. And one thing that we have been talking about and working through is that it's okay to have errors. It's okay to put out an error, that just have your heart behind it. And it seems like you would agree. Now, you're talking about, and this is, I think, critical, and it hit me hard when you said it. When I said, how do you get over it? How do you stop being scared? How do you stop being inner critic? How do you stop holding yourself back? And you basically say, you don't stop the feeling. That's a conversation I have with my kids a lot. We'll do parkour and they got to jump off something, or we'll try something new, or they will write something that they've never written, or we'll go to a haunted house or something. This comes up, and it's the same what you just said. They try to say, how, Dad, do I not be afraid to do this? And I tell them basically what you said. See, it's not about the being afraid or not. You're going to be afraid. It's going to feel uneasy. But what the difference is that you do it anyway. You don't let that hold you back. And it seems like that's what you're saying. And that thing that's helped my kids, I think, can help us as podcasters. What else do you have around that you think would be valuable for the listener right now?
I totally agree. And that's the definition of bravery, is being afraid and then doing it anyway. So you have the fear, but you also have a new thing that's emerged into your body, which is bravery that only comes about because of the fear. So that's an important thing for me, because a part of my life is creating practices around feelings that I want to encourage in my life. And being brave is a big one, because as an entrepreneur, that's where you get paid. Like you have to be brave. It is scary. You realize that perfectionism is an emotion that arises in your body and that comes out with work, which is kind of cool, because like perfectionism can bring out the most in you. It's not a bad thing, but like the definition of perfectionism, particularly as it's inhibiting your work, is that those two things go hand in hand. So like I want perfectionism to arise because it brings the best out of me, but I also want to be brave, which allows me to actually publish the work and get it out. So for me, I had to create a practice. And the practice was Ryan, you're going to put this out. You're going to do the best you can, but you're going to realize that it's going to be a little bit clumsy. It's not going to be as perfect as it could possibly be, but you're going to let it go and you're not going to judge it until your 100th episode. And when I began, that was the kind of journey I wanted to go on. I didn't want to do 5 episodes and that was cool, whatever, move on to something else. It's like, I love this. I love talking to people. I love connecting with people. I like making these podcasts. I'm not going to let any other feeling get in the way of what I'm really doing, because again, okay, this is actual happiness. This is an opportunity for me to be happy. I'm not going to let perfectionism kill my happiness. So I want to create practice around it. And for me, this goal of 100 episodes was like, wow, by 100 episodes, I'll have it all worked out. I'll know exactly how to get things done and I'll be perfect at that point. So at that point, then I'm going to really dive in and be critical of my show. So that gave me just the actual practice to be brave enough to get my shows out and move, which was helpful. Again, these are just like little weird mental triggers, but for me, it was enough to like get it done and stick with it.
I'm curious if you listen to your old podcast episodes. I think this is good for the listener too. Do you get embarrassed? What happens when you listen to like your first 30 episodes, for example, or your first 5 episodes or your first 100 episodes? How do you feel about them?
Oh, I feel terrible. I can't listen to them at all.
Is that true?
Oh, yeah. True? I can't listen to my podcast.
And so like, what should the listener take from that? Does it mean they shouldn't do a podcast at all? Or what should the listener, another podcaster or a future podcaster, take from you hate your first some odd episodes?
I hate them all. I mean, I guess I don't hate them. It's just, it's really challenging for me to listen to myself. And I think that's a lot of folks feel that way. Mm-hmm. So I don't listen to them. That way I don't have to feel that way.
Should it hold us back? Or should we do it anyway, even though we think or we understand that we might be like Ryan and one day look back and be embarrassed by the first pieces of content that we put out?
It depends. It's not for everybody. I think if you like it, then do it. If it makes you happy, don't stop. There's going to be a lot of opportunities to quit for a bunch of different reasons. I really want people to keep doing it if they enjoy it. It's an experience, right? So like if you enjoy the experience, great. If you don't like listening to your podcast afterwards, don't listen to it. If it's critical that you have to edit them, then have somebody else do it, which is kind of what I did. If you're like me, where you really enjoy podcasting, but you don't like to listen to the podcast, whatever you do, don't transcribe it and read it. Boy, that'll really put you over the edge.
Yeah. So one thing that helps me, because I grew up and I have like ADD and dyslexia and some other random stuff or whatever. I always felt like I was a little bit different. Something that helps me, because I know that I'm not the most eloquent. I know that I'm not the best. I'm not the smartest. And sometimes I will repeat myself a couple of times or 4 or 5 times. The listener knows. And that can get embarrassing when you think about yourself and you think about perfectionism and you think about wanting to make a good impression, for example. And the biggest thing that's really helped me to put out content anyway and to be okay with making mistakes is if I'm really thinking of my heart, not my head. If I'm thinking about the love that I have for people, the content that I want to give them, how much I want to pour into them versus how I want to sound, how impressive I want to be. If I care about how impressive I am, I'm not going to do it. But if I care about if I'm giving good value straight from the heart, then I'm going to put out good content and be okay with all the mistakes that I make. Have you ever had any situation like that? Have you thought that way, or am I kind of alone?
Totally alone, man.
I figured I was.
No, I totally share that, especially about repeating yourself. To me, it's like I'll start to get self-conscious that like, man, I keep saying the same things and like people are going to think I'm disrespecting their intelligence or that like blah, blah, blah. But if you look at really the most popular public figures and speakers, they simplify their message down to 1 or 2 words. And they just hammer it over and over and over and over. If you're Grant Cardone, you're the 10X guy, or you're Tim Ferriss and you're the 4-hour work week guy. Yeah. Like you really narrow and you actually just keep hitting the beats. In a musical sense, it's just like you run the hooks and you get to the chorus and everybody loves the chorus. So I think it's actually really important to practice saying the same things over and refining it smaller and smaller and smaller. It's really hard to do. One little technique here, again, of like creating a practice around this, which starts with a feeling that I want to inspire, that creates thought, and then I bring that into a practice, is just the idea of a person's actual attention span. I really feel that like you got to tell somebody 10 times before they even hear you once. And if they're locked into you, you got to tell them 10 times in order for them to hear you once. Now, if we're on a podcast, and let's just be generous and assume that the audience is giving us 10% of their attention. So they're listening to a podcast, they're folding laundry, they're thinking about picking up their kids in a couple hours. We've got 10% of their attention right now. So that means we're going to actually have to say it 100 times in order for them to hear it one time to really comprehend what was said. They're like, wow, this is starting to make sense. It's like, well, I hope so, because I just said it 99 times.
Yeah.
In this way, it liberates me to like be repetitive and to use the same language and to like try and hone down a message, because it's just out of respect for the listener. It's like, dude, I don't expect you to like focus in on what I'm saying. You know what I mean? Like, fold your laundry, man. It's cool. I'm going to stick with this one thing because I want to keep the messages tight and concise. That's something I'm working on. I'm terrible at it, but definitely when I'm talking to other people, particularly as guests in podcasts, it's like, this is why you get a lot of reps. As a podcaster, this is why you do a lot of episodes, is really to simplify your message, to make it easier for everybody to understand and hit that over and over again. And you'll know that you've got something because it'll start to resonate in the world and you'll start to see it spread. And you're like, ooh, this is something I should continue based on that feedback. So yeah. I totally relate though, of like, man, I say this is my old stuff. I say the same thing over and over again. But really, I think it's just working through that again with having the bravery to like, no, man, I'm going to go on this and see if it works. And if not, we'll pivot. That I think is kind of important, particularly for podcasters.
Yeah. I'm thinking about how you said that you were not going to judge your podcast until your 100th episode. And I think that's a good subject to sit on just for a moment. When I have potential clients coming and wanting to launch a podcast with us, I'll always say, as a minimum, don't come in here thinking you're going to try it for a month or 2 or 3. Don't even do it to say that the first year is where you're stopping. I always say, put this at 3 years. Like if you're going to do it for 3 years or more, go ahead and start with us. If you're not even sure about the first 3 years, maybe don't have a podcast. With you, Ryan, you said you're not going to judge your podcast until the 100th episode. And I know that a listener gulped. They're like, what? Because sometimes we want 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Sometimes we want to dabble. We want to test the waters. We want to see what it's like. We don't want to be fully pot committed because we don't know if it'll work out. And so I want to sit here for a second and talk about, if you were talking to a podcaster or a future podcaster, somebody who wanted to, what would you say to them as far as how many episodes or how many years or how much time to spend doing it, whether it's working or not in the very beginning? What's a minimum for you?
That's a great question, because podcasting can be very expensive, both with money, but especially time. And you're going to be concerned about a lot of different variables and like, how does a show go and all this and this and this and this. And a lot of this just creates analysis paralysis. So if you're brand new, you're like, I got an idea for a podcast and it's 10 feet tall. It's this, and we're going to do about. It's like, okay, cool. First, you got to understand if you're going to like this and you're going to stick with it. A great test I like to give is like, record 6 conversations with your friends. If you can, go get coffee and just record it through the voice memo on your phone. Record the conversation. Something magical happens when you hit record, because now you're locked into that conversation much more so than if you were just going to the coffee shop with your friend where everyone's checking their phones or whatever. If you can do it in real life, do that. It adds an element of magic. If not, do it on Zoom. Be like, okay, I'm going to record a podcast. I don't even know what it's going to be about. I just want to record this as a podcast episode. I may never release it. And do that 6 times. That will tell you whether you like it or not. That'll inform you a lot of like what your natural tendencies are, what your talents are, what you're interested in, and hopefully give you some confidence to keep going. It might also be like, wow, I'm so glad I didn't spend $5,000 on microphones and preamps because that was too scary and I hated it.
And by the way, listener, you don't have to spend $5,000.
No,
go
you
to
don't.
growyourshow.com/PDF and get a PDF of much more affordable stuff. So Ryan, you're talking about doing those first 6 recordings.
Yeah.
And I think it's brilliant advice. I really believe that I would have been better off doing that. A lot of my clients would have been better off doing that. A lot of other podcasters would have been better off doing that. So let's just say that they go through the 6, they figure out, they hone in, they know what they want to talk about, they know what they like, they know what they're interested in. From there, what would be the minimum? Because you said you're not even going to judge your podcast till the 100th episode. What's kind of the window for that new podcaster, if you had one?
Yeah, after 6 episodes, you're all in. You're like, this is a blast. I love it. Now I got 6 episodes in the can. At that point, like, it's probably good to build a team around you. And I really can't think of a better team than Adam Adams. You know what I'm saying?
Gosh, I owe you money now.
I mentioned Ryan Estes at checkout to save yourself an extra 10%. I can't help.
Hold on. We might not be able to do that, actually. Cut it. Don't let that in.
Don't do that.
But Ryan, good stuff. So stick to it like forever or for 3 years, or is there another timeline that you'd have?
No, yeah, I like your idea of like, hey, I'm going to commit to this for 3 years.
Okay.
That seems like an awesome timetable because it also reflects a part of podcasting that I really like too, is it's almost devotional practice. Podcasting is like the avenue in which we're expressing the thing, right? I mean, it's funny because both you and I have podcasts about podcasting. So we have this like burning passion about the medium itself, but oftentimes people don't resonate as a podcaster. It's like, no, man, I'm into real estate investments. That's my thing. I'm just using podcasting as an expression for this in the same way that like a cathedral is an expression for the devotion to the divine. You know what I'm saying? Like it doesn't necessarily need to be about the podcast, but like the best podcasts are really going to be devotional practice about the thing. And you're using this alchemy of conversation, especially interview shows with other people, to inspire the thing that you're so passionate about. So if you're starting to think about, okay, this is a 3-year commitment, that might whittle down and narrow down the topics of your podcast that you really want to dive into it for. You're like, do you really want to do a true crime podcast for 3 years and muddy yourself in the bones and suffering of people? Like if you do, I mean, there's big audiences for that, but like that's going to be what you're into. So yeah. I like the time frame because I think it helps qualify what's going to be most important to you. What's something that you actually want to dedicate that kind of a time and attention to.
Perfect. We're going to take a short break. And when we get back, we're going to talk about how you, the listener, as a podcaster, you need to start getting booked on other people's podcasts to really grow your brand, grow your audience, grow your comfortability talking about what you're doing, and certainly to make more money. Getting you booked. The other thing we're going to talk about is you making money with your show, making sure that it puts money in your pocket rather than taking money out of your pocket. We'll be right back. Hey, my friend, as you know, this episode is sponsored by my company, GrowYourShow.com. We want you to be able to have the best tools at your disposal without costing you a whole arm and a leg. So right now you can get a free list of vetted equipment that like mics, mixers, webcams, sound treatment, editing software, everything that you need. I created the whole PDF with direct purchase links just to save you time and money, to help it be more convenient for you. So this free PDF will help you skip all the guesswork. If it's on there, it's vetted and approved by yours truly. And if it's not on there, it's probably not worth the money. So go ahead and get yours at growyourshow.com/PDF. Let's get back into the show. Ryan has shared with us so much on this episode already about algorithms, about making sure that you're not going to judge yourself until the 100th episode, about perfectionism, about not worrying about errors, launching, rebranding. We've talked about your inner critic that can hold you back, how to avoid it or how to ignore it and just keep going. And there's 2 things that I think are going to be beneficial to you. And Ryan's got 2 different companies as well. So I want to give him opportunity to talk about those because you probably need to be growing your influence. And one of the best ways you could do it is by getting booked on other people's podcasts. Another thing is your podcast is probably costing you money every single month. And so we want to talk about a way that you might be able to be putting some money into your pocket rather than it costing you so that it can keep the longevity of your podcast. So let's talk about Kitcaster a little bit now. What do you do? How does it work? How much is it going to cost the listener? What kind of does that look like to work with Kitcaster and get booked on podcasts?
You bet. And this show is largely for podcast hosts, right, Adam?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So working with Kitcaster as a podcaster is totally free. And what Kitcaster does is provides you with the world's best podcast guests. Our clients want to go on podcasts. Typically, these people are funded startup founders. They're entrepreneurs with multiple exits. They're C-suite executives in kind of the tip of the spear technology brands, whether that's AI or that's blockchain or that's real estate investment or SaaS companies. These are people that are pushing the culture in a way that benefits everybody largely. And they want to tell everybody about it and use podcasts for it. So what Kitcaster does is we basically pitch our clients onto other people's podcasts to be interviewed so that it's not a sales pitch. They want to have conversations. They want to have tip of the spear conversations about what's happening in business and technology right now. So if you need guests, if you have a guest show, Kitcaster is totally free for you.
Where do they go? Is it just Kitcaster
It's kitcaster.com/podcaster-newsletter.
Okay. My assistant who's editing this just wrote all that down.
Great.
And it's in the show notes now. So if you're listening, you don't have to worry about pulling over or spelling it wrong or missing a hyphen or something. It's in the show notes. Just scroll down and you can jump right to that link. Keep going, Ryan.
Perfect. Yeah. And basically what that does is once a month, we'll have a little feature newsletter where we're featuring either new candidates or we'll do kind of seasonal candidates. So if it's like, hey, a Father's Day, you want to work on a Father's Day episode, here's 6 people that are dads that want to talk about what being a father means to them and their company or things of that nature. So totally free, no commitment, obviously. And that'll just give you a great introduction to what Kitcaster does and kind of how we operate.
So not only can you pay to get on other people's podcasts and grow your own audience?
Yeah.
But for the listener, and I know that this is common, we feel like we're running out of guests, good guests. We feel like we don't know who to call or how to call them or how to approach them. So you're saying we go to that link, kitcaster.com/something-something, and it's already in the show notes. And we can actually be introduced to potential guests that would work for our show. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. There's 20 of us in Denver and sprinkled through the country and our whole job is to making sure that you find relevant guests for your show.
Cool.
And that those guests are totally prepped and ready to do great for the interview.
And can we talk about monetizing our show with sponsored host-read ads?
Absolutely.
The biggest question that I have that I would like you to start at is, how do we get paid? Is it a CPM? And if so, what is the CPM and how do we increase to maximize how much money we can make by doing host-read ad on our own show?
You bet. Yeah. And podcast advertising is kind of split up into 2 ways. You got kind of host-read and you've got programmatic. Programmatic is similar to the ads that are on YouTube videos where you just allow for that to happen and then YouTube puts in the ads they want. Mm-hmm. Host-read are actually where you read. I mean, you don't read it verbatim, but basically you're giving your endorsement to a product. We've all heard it for athletic greens. Listen to a podcast and everyone's talking about AG1. That's a host-read ad. And so second part of that is people get paid by a CPM, which is cost per mile, which some reason it's mile, but it's cost per thousand really is what they're talking about.
Yeah, cost per mil, MIL, which means 1,000 in, Spanish, but also Latin.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cost per thousand.
Okay, so I was reading it wrong the whole time. I was like, what is this, some kind of like marathon term here? Cost per meal. Yeah, meal is 1,000, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Adam. So essentially, how much are you going to get for 1,000 listens? In the programmatic space, it's going to be significantly less. Maybe it's $2 to $10. So you get 1,000 listens, you get paid $10. That's the $10 CPM. Host-read is more. So if you're getting paid $20, $21 per 1,000 downloads, you're doing pretty good. Now, generally speaking, this is a great model for big podcasts. If you got 1 million downloads and a brand wants to give you $20 CPM, you're going to make some good money. But the podcasts we work with in a company called Wildcast, which is gowildcast.com, has more niche podcasts. And largely we're working in technology and business focused podcasts. So in this model, like a $10 to $20 CPM might be good, but for very specific podcasts that have very engaged audiences, we can do much better. And that's because podcasts in business and technology will never have millions of downloads. These are podcasts that are solving problems and tackling issues that a very select audience even cares about. But that means that the quality of their attention is much greater. So if we were talking about an average podcast, maybe you have 10% of their attention. If people are coming to your show to solve a particular problem, you might have 30-40% of their attention. If it's a really important podcast, you might have 90% of their attention and they're listening closely. So we really believe at Wildcast that the value of that smaller audience is huge, particularly for technology brands that are looking for conversions from hard to reach clients.
So which is how exactly do they get paid? Like it's not going to be $20 anymore, right? Because if it was a niche audience and let's just say it's 200 people and that is 200 is a fifth of a meal, a fifth of 1,000. And so if you're going to get 20 per CPM, then what is that? Like $4?
Yeah.
But I doubt that they're going to put that ad on for just $4 an episode. So how are they getting paid when they do it that way?
You bet. So that's a great example. So for example, what if those 200 people, it's like, dude, that's nothing. But what if those 200 people were all venture capitalists? Well, that puts a different temperature on that audience if your ideal audience are venture capitalists. So what becomes very important is to be able to measure accurately the relevancy of that audience. And that's what Wildcast does better than anybody else. Okay. We're taking all the demographic, psychographic information that's available for podcast audiences. We're adding that with AI transcribed of the actual episodes so we can get sentiment analysis. And then we're also doing host reported statistics so that we can match podcast audiences, podcast hosts in a brand with just unprecedented relevance, which just creates value for everybody. Because honestly, if you're running a show for women and you're doing programmatic ads and advertisement for Manscaped comes on, you might get people tuning out.
You never know. Maybe that woman would be excited to have their lover. At any rate, about how much money would we be talking? It's not going to be $4 anymore. What's Correct. Kind of a different range that it might be?
Totally varies. I'd say from $50 to $5,000 a month.
Sick.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So really what we're looking for, there's no minimum downloads to join the platform as a podcast. You can go to gowildcast.com and click the button that says podcaster, fill out the form. It takes a couple of minutes. Again, there's definitely no fees. You're there as a podcaster to get paid. Everything awesome. Comes to you delivered as an opportunity first, which you can always say no to, of course. The platform here is to find the most relevant brand opportunities to advertise on your show.
I think we got a lot out of today's episode and a couple of really great resources, which are in the show notes. Ryan Estes, thank you for jumping on. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Adam.
You know, I really don't say this nearly enough. I don't mention this and I feel horrible because it's a great resource for you to be able to take your podcast to the next level. And it's simply a free resource that I don't need your email or anything. It's just a podcasting course that I created that is ended up putting in the very first 6 episodes of this podcast. So if you haven't checked it out, definitely going to want to just check out those first 6 episodes, see how they can help you improve your podcast, get in front of more people, and have a better result where you're making more money through the podcast, etc. So much can happen after you listen through episodes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So if you haven't done it, go do it now. And by the way, if you're subscribed, you'll keep hearing more great content. So to those of you who are, I'll see you on the next episode.